when you think about like what does the back end mean, like the back end means that like it's going to support some sort of front end UI for the consumer to start to have an engagement with. And so as you start to see the press talk nonstop about sort of like, wow, GPT and AI and all this stuff is the most revolutionary thing I've ever seen. It's like, of course it is, because this is the front end consumer experience, right? But the New York Times the other day had this great article, and I think the headline was, "Can you trust this picture?" Right? It was designed by AI. And the answer is yes, right? If you think about what blockchain technology does from the back end as a verifying, immutable source of truth, right? And so I think that for the first 2 years, what we saw was people really glamorizing the technology from a consumer perspective, but not realizing that the technology is an exercise in efficiency, right? And in an ability to provide verifiability.
Hey everyone, welcome to Web3 Deep Dive. I'm your host, Rachel Wolfson. This show focuses on real-world Web3 use cases to help you better understand how this technology is being applied today and how it may be applied in the future. If this sounds interesting, please be sure to subscribe to the show so you stay up to date with all of the new episodes. Before getting started with today's episode, I'd like to thank Wursta for making Web3 Deep Dive possible. Wursta is a global technology consultancy with headquarters in Austin, Texas, and Quito, Ecuador. Wursta works with enterprises to help them make sound business decisions on all of their core technologies. And before we get started with the show, I also just want to remind you guys that Web3 Deep Dive is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not offer any forms of financial advice at all. Without further ado, let's dig deep into Web3. Hey Keith, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining Web3 Deep Dive today.
Well, thank you both for having me.
Right, and also I want to introduce Deanna, the co-host, who's kind of like the mind behind Wursta and Wurst collabs, which, you know, they're doing the show with us.
Yeah, so glad to be here today.
Yeah,
Good to
thanks
see you,
Deanna. Thanks guys. So Keith, you're in Austin. What are your thoughts about being here for Consensus?
I look, I've said it numerous times publicly. I'm just so utterly impressed with what they've put together. I'm a huge personal fan of Sam and Casey and the CoinDesk team, but just to see 15,000 people in Austin building, heads down, and the amount of companies here, just amazing.
Right, it is. There's I feel like everyone in the crypto industry is in Austin right now. Like they're all here.
Yeah, no, and you know what's funny about what you just said is it's not just crypto industry, it's crypto technology, right? Like I have not had a single conversation about cryptocurrencies today, but I have had, it's 8:00 in the morning, so of course I haven't had many today. But like in general, my time has been spent talking about sort of like what is the value of blockchain technology and how can it be applicable to sort of GPT technology and all of the emerging sort of reinvention that's happening on the internet today.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's good that everyone they're taking a technology mindset, which is what this industry needs.
Totally.
So Keith, I want to talk a little bit about your background before we get into Web3 and enterprises, which is the topic that we're speaking about today. But so you are the president of enterprise at MoonPay?
Correct.
Okay. What does that mean?
Sure. So I mean, essentially I oversee all of the monetization of MoonPay, right? And the teams at MoonPay that roll up into me are, the sales team, the marketing team, the comms team, the concierge team, Otherlife. We just purchased we acquired a Web3 agency, and special projects, right? And as part of my remit, it's how can we make sure that we could take all of the great technology that MoonPay has built, right, from end-to-end architecture. Like if you want to enter into the ecosystem, how can you use your credit card? If you want to do enterprise-grade minting, how can you sort of employ that? If you need commerce solutions, marketplace as a solution, no problem. But at the same time, like the reason that the acquisition of Otherlife was so important, which was previously known as Nightshift, was MoonPay had built a great sort of horizontal solution for companies that had figured out that they wanted to enter into Web3 and knew what their strategy was, with Other Life, now part of our portfolio, we could sit down with organizations and say, let us help you with ideation, strategy, and front end development. Oh, and then by the way, we have all of the infrastructure behind the scenes to help power you.
Interesting. And MoonPay, am I describing MoonPay correctly? A crypto payments platform?
So MoonPay started as a crypto payments platform, and this is actually one of the things that I'm working on right now with the team. Right, when it was born out of this notion of how do you make crypto easy? Right, how can you actually just use your credit card and enter into the ecosystem? Right, as the company has begun to mature, I mean, it's only 4 years old, right? Like what we've seen is they've built a lot of the solutions necessary for enterprises to be able to expand. And so what we're beginning to see now is that like we have Hypermint, which is an enterprise grade, minting solution, stuff that we used for Universal Studios, for Nike with the dot swoosh, for Fox, that can handle, really high volumes and transaction speeds. And then how do we then all of a sudden take all of our sort of other offerings, whether it's like the marketplace as a service or, the off-ramps and the on-ramps, combine them together so that way we're on one end a crypto payments provider, but on the other end a Web3 marketing infrastructure company.
Interesting.
Yeah, it seems like you're putting together all the pieces to make it easy for almost any size enterprise to start to get into Web3. Are you, it sounds like you're working more with the larger companies. Is there a specific target?
So right now, I mean, we are working with larger companies. There's some smaller companies that we work with and some companies that we think are really just incredible from an emerging standpoint, right? So yes, like we're known for what we did with Universal or Fox or the Nikes of the world. But at the same time, like we've had, I would say, one of the most incredible partnerships with the Alo Yogas of the world, which I know you love personally. Alo is a fascinating one for me, right? Because I'm not the target for Alo, right? I'm barely flexible, right? But Angelique, who's the CMO over there, is an incredible mind, and she's just very creative in what she knows her sort of brand permissions are. But what she identified very quickly was it wasn't about the technology, right? It wasn't about whether it was Web3. It was about how she can actually empower her community to have better experiences using this technology, right? And so we work with, all sorts of companies up and down, but the companies that we're really focused on right now are companies that, in essence, own their audience, right? So we can start to show them how they can evolve out of using the technology for what I would say is PFP drops and JPEGs, and more for memberships and subscriptions and loyalty and rewards.
Yeah, let's break that down a little bit, because Web3 technology, when brands leverage it, there are so many capabilities. But can you go into a little bit more detail? How can brands actually communicate and own and, be a part of their audience, I guess, using Web3 technology?
Sure. So here's a really good simplified example that I would just give right off the bat, which is, business would be really easy if people weren't in it, right? Because then all of a sudden, like all the irrationalities of how businesses have to operate would just be a pure play efficiency spreadsheet sort of exercise. The reality of most businesses today are they operate on verticalized P&Ls, and most of the P&Ls don't talk to each other. And what you on one end find is that the holistic view of what a consumer is to a company just doesn't exist, right? So take Ralph Lauren, for instance, right? Because I think this is a really easy illustrative example. Ralph Lauren has one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York City, right? Have you been there?
No, I haven't. What is it?
It's called the Polo Bar.
Okay.
Right?
I should go.
And if I want to go to the Polo Bar, I have to call 900 times, and I could probably get a reservation 6 months out. It's that exclusive, right? If you look at my sort of consumer sort of behavior with Ralph Lauren, I own a lot of Ralph Lauren sweaters, right? I own a lot of Ralph Lauren suits and shirts and clothes. I own Ralph Lauren furniture, right? in my apartment, I use Ralph Lauren paint, right? These are four totally different P&L lines and divisions of Ralph Lauren as a company. When I call Ralph Lauren to make that reservation at the Polo Bar, I'm nobody, right? And so what you find is that a lot of companies are designed vertically, right, but not horizontally. And so I think like one of the biggest sort of advantages of blockchain technologies is the ability for you to see a holistic view of your customer, right? Like I should be able to be prioritized across sort of my engagement with that brand based on my investment in other areas when I call over here. So that way they can give me a better sort of holistic Ralph Lauren experience. At the end of the day, I think where the technology really advances and evolves for companies is in memberships, is in subscriptions, is in loyalty, is in rewards, right? That's the visible consumer front. On the invisible front, I think it's just an exercise in efficiency, right? Removing intermediaries, right? But when you start to move into that world where like a lot of intermediaries are in the financial space or in, government space, there's so much regulation in the way that I actually think that we're going to see a Web3 evolution take place first on the consumer front that's going to ultimately inflect back on the larger sort of financial and business ecosystem.
That's such a great example. And I think a lot of companies still don't understand that piece, how it's going to help them actually be closer to their consumer. But the financial piece of it is really fascinating. I agree with you. The consumer is going to come first. But how do you think it will eventually affect the financial side for businesses?
I think, Web3 is a few different things. I think of it holistically as the complete reinvention of the internet, whether it's through blockchain technologies, GPT technologies, or metaverse and AR experiences, right? All combining, right? And I think that historically, the way that it has been reported is people looked at NFTs and they thought that NFTs were the front end consumer experience. And my argument would be like, yes, in art and collectibles, like the NFT token is more visible to the individual than it would be when you get to membership, subscriptions, loyalty, reward, and everything else, right? When you get to the latter stuff, which is where I think that the space actually scales the most, right? The token and the blockchain relationship is just actually an invisible infrastructure level, right? Like the consumer's never going to think about this, and it's going to be infinite tokens out there. It's not going to be limited supplies of tokens. And ultimately, when you think about like, what does the back end mean? Like the back end means that like it's going to support some sort of front end UI for the consumer to start to have an engagement with. And so as you start to see the press talk nonstop about sort of like, wow, GPT and AI and all this stuff is the most revolutionary thing I've ever seen. It's like, of course it is, because this is the front end consumer experience, right? But the New York Times the other day had this great article, and I think the headline was, "Can you trust this picture?" Right? It was designed by AI. And the answer is yes, right? If you think about what blockchain technology does from the back end as a verifying, immutable source of truth, right? And so I think that for the first 2 years, what we saw was people really glamorizing the technology from a consumer perspective, but not realizing that the technology is an exercise in efficiency, right? And in an ability to provide verifiability.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you say that, Keith, because I've been in the industry since 2017, and I initially got in because of the technology and because of the efficiency side. Blockchain technology for supply chain management was kind of a hot topic in 2017 with what IBM was doing with their food program to track and trace food. And then I feel like that narrative got lost when private blockchains kind of disappeared and people were focused so much on ICOs and cryptocurrency. And now, based on what you're saying, that narrative is coming back in terms of blockchain for transparency, but for brands, not really for like these companies like IBM. I think with the private blockchain network, that kind of died at IBM.
Yeah, I think that that's correct. And, we've seen this before, right? Like I always joke that I'm a Web3 geriatric, right? But like when I started at Wired in 2002, and I interned at Wired when I was in college, right? And when I started at Wired in 2002, like you have to realize like where that was in the technology cycle post .com boom, right? So we are in the point of bust, right, feels a little bit like where we were 6 months ago today. And on the first day that I started at Wired, first day, my grandfather, who's not a nice person, but we could talk about that on a completely different podcast, okay, calls me up and he says, "Congratulations on your new job. I don't know why you took that job. You all thought that we were going to buy dog food online with your internet thing." That was so cute, right? Now, I know you have a dog because if anyone follows you on Instagram, they see your Bichon nonstop, right? I have a dog, right? She's prettier on Instagram, absolutely batshit crazy. But, like, all I know is that I ordered my dog food online last week from ... the largest company on the planet, Amazon, right? And that is where the world went. But, like, you have to have these sort of manic moments where people think that all the technology can save everything and solve every problem. And then you have to have a correction for all of sort of the charlatans and the terrible use cases to fall out for there to be like a real level reset for building towards where utility and value can be derived. That's where I think we are today. That's, by the way, when you ask me, what do I think of consensus? That's what I'm seeing at Consensus today is the amount of conversations I'm having with real brands, not talking about, how can I do a PFP drop, but rather like, how can I think about like using this technology to better my relationship with my consumer? Now, if I could pause for 1 second and just, point out another thing that I think that a lot of people are not paying attention to and that they should is we are seeing for the first time a real, not a fake, real evolution and a change in consumer privacy regulation, right? Like you're seeing it in Europe with GDPR, you're seeing it in the United States with CCPA. You're seeing Google finally say like, hey, I know we've been threatening for a while that we're going to sunset third-party cookies, but we're actually going to do it in the next year, right? And you're seeing the iOS sort of terms consistently get updated as it relates to consumer privacy in gaming and other areas. And so like what I mean by that, and the reason I highlight that is, like everyone has to recognize that the entire media and marketing ecosystem is actually built on a completely faulty foundation that you could just continuously extract consumer data from that individual without them ever making a tacit sort of acknowledgement that they're willing to give you that information. And I think that what's going to force this change is government regulation, which is going to be very healthy for the space. But what that's going to mean is that there's going to have to be a new way for the entire media and marketing ecosystem, and this is the world that I came from for 20 years, to think about how do they actually serve ads and marketing messages to their consumers if they can't extract as many insights and information from the consumer without their permission that they have in the past.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's the role where blockchain and zero knowledge proofs come in to play.
Yeah, I mean, Here's where it becomes really interesting. Like I saw this at Time, right? So at Time, what we did with timepieces, when you really think about it, at the end of the day, was we looked at the business model of Time and we said, there's really two revenue streams. There's episodic revenue, which is high dollar amount, short time frame. But this is advertisers, right? There's no consistency that it continues year after year. And then there's annuities, right? And annuities are short, small dollar amounts, long time frames, but they go on and on, right? And like I saw firsthand in 2020, when the world was ending, right? The only revenue stream that held up for Time was the annuities, right? But the annuity for Time was a $40 subscription, right? Digital subscription. With timepieces actually was an annuity, right? But instead of leading with the subscription, it led with community, right? And it said, listen, here is a way to buy into the community, to invest into the community. If you come into the community, we're going to give you access to certain experiences and certain sort of events and whatnot. And you don't have to tell us who you are. You could still participate and be part of the community, which is really interesting. Oh, and by the way, if you wish to connect your digital wallet to Time, it'll remove the paywall for you, right? So like without having to give any of your information, we'll give you all the access to the subscription. Now, what people don't realize is that and I think what a big misnomer is in Web3 is that the consumer always remains anonymous. The consumer's personal information remains anonymous. Like, I don't know that it's you, Rachel, right? I don't know it's you. But what I do know is I know all the things that your wallet is doing, right? Especially when you're on like the Ethereum blockchain or Polygon, like default public blockchains. I know all the things you're doing. And then when you connect to my website, I could see all the things that you read on through Google Analytics. I could connect those two identities together and get a really good sort of demographic for who you are as a consumer. Now, the question might be, well, I still don't know it's you, but at the end of the day, I could say, I don't really care that I don't know it's you, because I could still respect your privacy and give you a lot of information. But if I do want to know it's you, the difference between Web 2 and Web 3 is not complex. It just comes down to choice, right? And a lot of people focus on the choice as it relates to, do you want to be an online renter or an online owner? But it really comes down to choice as it relates to, do you want to hold on to your personal information, or do you want to trade it for something? And if you want to trade it, what that means is that the brand has to actually give you something that you value in return, right? And what I saw with time was, I said to the community with Maya Drazen, my partner over there, we'll give you 5 tickets to the Elon Musk, Person of the Year event, but you have to tell us who you are, and you have to take a PCR test. And tens of thousands of people entered in and said, like, here's who we are. We want to go to this, like, for this chance. Outside of time, you see that prior to Elon Musk buying Twitter, Twitter said, for $3 a month or whatever it was, we'll verify your NFT collection by giving you a hexagonal, NFT, logo. And everyone was all of a sudden like, oh my God, like, here's $3. Like, that was their trade-off, right? But they're willing to give their identity for that. But at MoonPay, right, like, I look at MoonPay and, we have 15 million customers, and 5.6 million of them have KYC'd with us in a far more complex KYC process, because there's financial transactions involved. And that's been based on the fact that, like, if you KYC, you get, higher ability to buy more crypto, or you get more sort of benefits. And so the trade-off doesn't have to be something as great as Elon Musk and, the Time Person of the Year party. The trade-off sometimes can be as simple as, like, I get a specific logo, or I get more access to something.
Wow, that's an incredibly important topic. I think a lot of folks still don't understand consumer privacy well, right? General public. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of fear around cryptocurrency in particular. I've heard even recently the idea of, I don't want to share my wallet address with you because it's insecure, which is just misinformed, right? I wonder if you would restate that. I think that was so incredibly important. The choice of a consumer and the idea that you can actually get something in return for sharing who you are.
Yeah, I mean, it was very funny. It took me a while to get to that conclusion. But when I started to really talk to people who thought that we were just absolutely insane with where this evolution was going, I realized, like, in the most simplistic terms, when you think about what is Web3 on the blockchain front, right? It really is, an evolution in efficiency, right? So it removes a lot of the intermediaries. And so for companies, right, like, why is that good? Companies are always going to focus on where the margins are, so that way they can increase their margins. And, like, by removing intermediaries, as many as they can get removed, right, they can increase their profits. But on the consumer front, it really comes down to choice, right? And that's the thing that I think that people don't talk about often enough. The choice is, do I want to remain in the current experience that I have online, which is totally fine. Remain in it if you want. Or do I want to become an online owner, right, as opposed to just a renter? Or do I want to give up my information as opposed to hold on to it, right? And so, like, right now, if you don't ever interact with a Web3 ecosystem, that choice is not presented to you, right? Like, when you're on Instagram, or you're on Twitter, or you're on Facebook, or you're on any of those platforms, LinkedIn, like, you are given the platform in return for all of your data, which is extracted and monetized. And if you don't believe that, you just don't understand how their business model works, right? Because that's what they do. In this sort of evolution, you're given the option of, like, be on those platforms, do something, do what you want to do, like, online, but you can hide. You don't have to tell who you are as an individual. Like, but I think that what people don't realize is that it's not a forced evolution. If you want to continue to sort of experience the internet as it is, amazing, you can. If you want these new options are going to ultimately lead to new experiences. And I think that what people are going to start to see in the next year to 2 years, and I just know from some of the conversations I'm having and some of the deals that we have in the pipeline at MoonPay, like, you're going to start to see better experiences coming from companies because they're using these technologies that are enabling experiences that previously weren't enabled.
Right. And I want to ask you about that because Web3 is new and it's early. And MoonPay is working with millions of companies, as you've said, and brands. Has that been easy to bring brands on board, or have they been hesitant? I mean, I remember, in 2017, you talk about blockchain technology to a major enterprise, and they were hesitant because that's like, oh, it's transparent. Everything is on chain. You can see everything. You can see all this information that we don't want other entities to see. So what has it been like for you and at MoonPay to bring companies on? Has it been difficult? Has it been easy?
Sure. So I think to answer the question, I think it's easy for me to like step back, right, on my career. Like, my career has always been come into organizations that need to evolve, turn around, be saved, or something of nature. So like, I never get the easy job of hey, this is social media after social media has been accepted up through the wazoo, right? And when you look at that, right, like when I was at Wired and I came back to Wired, in 2008, it was, how do we digitize Wired, right? Like, and we were the first brand to have over 50% of our revenue from digital revenue. And like, people thought we were crazy when we did that, right? How do we launch the Wired tablet edition that Steve Jobs held up and said, this is what a brand should be like on the iPad? And we weren't the first ones to come out with it, right? Like, the iPad came out on April 3rd of 2010. Like, Wired's tablet edition came out, I think, on May 25th, 2010. But the reason we were the most successful was because we thought about what the consumer experience would be first, right? And then we built for that, while everyone else treated the tablet as a magazine in its truest form, and, had a seam down the middle of the page, and it just wasn't a good consumer UI. With Ars Technica, right? Like, it was, how do you use data as a predictive algorithm to sort of, help, marketers reach consumers in articles that we knew would be read or would have a high likelihood of being read. And at Bloomberg, it was not only how do we bring all of Bloomberg's assets together into one sort of Bloomberg, but it was how do we launch QuickTake, which was social mobile video. But the thesis of QuickTake was Twitter's the largest distribution source of news on the planet, and the quickest, right? You can't compete with how fast Twitter distributes news, but you can't trust Twitter, right? Like, you don't know if what you're reading is right or wrong half the time. And the thought was, what if you could take all 2,400 journalists at Bloomberg and put it over Twitter, right? And turn it into, a social mobile news media experience for people. I say all these things because every instance where, like, I've been at a brand where we've evolved into the space, it's been when brands at mass have doubted what those evolutions have been, right? Like no brand says, oh my God, like, no brands at the largest level like knock at the door and say, oh my God, I want to do this. It's not until you show brands the power of what the experience can be that they start to realize, like, wow, I could do this. So when I look at Web3 and I look at Time, when I came out and announced that Time was going to enter into Web3 in March of 2021, I got more text messages from people in the industry that I knew asking if I was like crazy or on drugs or drinking. And by the way, if you know me, like, I don't really drink. I don't do drugs. I'm like, literally all I drink is coffee and seltzer. Right? I'm like a 90-year-old, right?
I am also, by the way.
Right? Like, it's just hilarious. But it wasn't until all of a sudden one day everyone sort of looked at the on-chain data and was like, wait a minute, they did, $10 million in profit right, in 12 months, that they started to take it very seriously. And that's the moment where we start to diversify out the revenue streams at time. At MoonPay, I think we're at a much different moment in time with our conversations. Almost all of our conversations with clients today surround memberships, subscriptions, loyalty, and rewards, right? Like that are coming into the space. And how can we think about making them more efficient and effective in delivering better experiences, more engaging experiences to their consumers? I feel confident with like the blue chip sort of conversations that we're having, that as more people start to see the success that these brands will have, like at one point it's just going to be so common sense that people are going to want a Web3 strategy that no one's even going to call it a Web3 strategy, right? And if I'm successful in 2 years or 3 years in my role, MoonPay is just an invisible infrastructure layer, right? It's not leading the conversation, right? It's just supporting and empowering and making sure that all of these companies that partner with us are successful in terms of, being able to implement these type of strategies.
Right. Deanna, I'm actually curious to know your thoughts on something, because you are, Worsta is a Google Cloud service provider and you're working with companies that are using Google products. What are your thoughts on everything that Keith is saying? I mean, Google is a huge part of this, and I think Google's Web3 strategy is, that's kind of something that you're trying to introduce to companies. Maybe, I think I'm right about that, but maybe I'm wrong. But anyways, what are your thoughts on that?
You're right. It's interesting to hear that the conversation has already moved forward. One, I'm surprised after all the success you've had in similar moments in your career that people still thought you were crazy for jumping on the new technology.
I'm always crazy. I like that. Like my favorite moments are being the crazy person on the hilltop screaming, "Look at this! Look at this! Look at this!" And the worst part is when everyone adopts it, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, that's real.
Guess you were right.
It's like, and I don't need the guess I was right. I just I love the evolution. I love the continued advancement. Right.
Yeah. It's interesting as the market has changed over the last 2 years, moving from a lot of hype around NFTs and then a lot of crash and burn between FTX and Binance, etc. I think that people are realizing now that you have to take control of the situation, right? It's not something to be afraid of, right? It reminds me a lot of 2009, 2010, mobile apps first coming out, right? At first, enterprises thinking, I don't need to jump on this bandwagon, but then very quickly turning to say, oh my gosh, I don't have an app yet, and my competitors do, so I've got to jump on it. I think we're seeing similar things now. And so seeing big companies like Google and Amazon get behind Web3 is not surprising at all. I don't even think it'll be a differentiator at this point, right? It's like it's becoming more like table stakes, right? If you're not in Web3, then you're not hip on the latest trends, right? I think even deeming it as Web3, and it is the reinvention of the internet, very much like you said, is a little bit of a misnomer because it is just the evolution of all the technology to date, right? So it's not about getting on the bandwagon. It's really just about keeping up with the times.
Yeah, I mean, you said a few things that I couldn't agree with more, right? In a few years, I don't think anyone's going to refer to things as Web3 companies, right? The same way that you don't refer to Amazon as Amazon.com or Facebook as Facebook.com. .com companies just don't exist anymore because they are companies, because it's been incorporated into how they operate, right? And so it's easy to simply sort of classify this as sort of like Web3 today. But ultimately, like, I don't think that a single company is going to use the term Web3 in 2 to 3 years, because it's just going to be companies that are doing that. On the one other thing, and I would say on the mobile front, which I think is fascinating, is if you do look right at the way that mobile was adopted by companies, like everyone knew that the trend was going to come, and the company's adoption lagged tremendously. When I was at Bloomberg, there was a feature on the terminal that allowed you to scrape earnings reports for keywords, right? And I loved this feature, and I used it with my team nonstop. And the one that I found that I thought was the most interesting was Starbucks, right? So I was at Bloomberg from 2014 to 2018. And we would scrape the Starbucks earnings report, And Howard Schultz and the CFO would consistently use the word mobile 5 times as much as their competitors did in their earning report, right? Now picture this, right? Like more people have the Starbucks app on their phone, right, today than any other app that I know of, as you know, in that space, right? Like I don't know, and I actually don't know a single person who has the Dunkin' Donuts app. I don't know if there is a Dunkin' Donuts app, right? But there's a
is.
Starbucks app. Is there? Really?
Do you
And
have
it's
it,
like,
Deanna?
Do you?
I do,
You?
yeah.
So wow, this is amazing. Look at what you've done. Like on this podcast, I have now identified the first human being ever with the Dunkin' Donuts app compared to the Starbucks app, right?
I love
I have
that.
both.
You have both. Okay, there we go. Okay, but like my point is that Starbucks has 1 trillion people on their apps, and Dunkin' Donuts has Deanna, right? And in saying that though, right? Like what Starbucks has been able to actually do is actually get closer to the consumer with their app, right? And also, create an incredible loyalty program with their app. If Starbucks, I would argue, has one of the most successful loyalty programs out there, right? Maybe in the world, like they see something in Web3 technology to be able to start to launch their own loyalty program there, because I think what what they recognize is that this technology will ultimately become part of their larger ecosystem over time, and they won't be separate. They'll just merge together, but they want to make sure that they're taking advantage of all of the latest and greatest abilities to increase the relationship that they can have with their consumer.
Right. I mean, everything you've said is just miraculous. I mean, it's all, it makes sense, but I think that there are some issues when it comes to consumers and when they hear NFTs, for instance. So Starbucks, they're introducing NFTs, right? But I think there are still some consumers out there, like my mom, for instance, and she goes to Starbucks regularly. She doesn't, she knows what an NFT is, but she would be frightened, I feel like, maybe not, but
so
to use an NFT.
No. But you bring up an amazing point, right? And this is the point that like we should really recognize. Okay, I wake up every day and I think about only 2 groups of people, right? My mother and my daughter, right? My mother is an 80-year-old. I think she's 80. She's close to 80. She's going to get angry if she sees this right now, but she'll get angry anyway when she sees my impersonation, because she always dislikes my impersonation of her. But like,
Okay.
My mother is not having a digital wallet. She's not buying crypto. She does not care about NFTs. She does not want to enter into the ecosystem, right? And so for my mother, it has to be as simple as the day she called me up and was like, Keith, you see, she does not like this impersonation. Keith, put me on the Twitter. Right. And I'm like, Mom, it's Twitter, but here you go. Right. And I just logged her in. My mom could not care less how Twitter works behind the scenes. Right. She just wants a better experience. And she saw that Twitter offered a better experience. Right. In no instance does my mom know what servers Twitter runs on, like what technology stacks they have. She doesn't care how many engineers they have. She doesn't care what UI systems they use. She just wants the experience. Right. So like, for mass adoption of this space to take place, you need to be able to actually provide the experience to my mother where her world doesn't change. She could still use her credit card. She could still use her email. She doesn't have to think about things like NFTs or technologies or any of that stuff. And by the way, we've seen this before, right? Like when computers were really beginning to mainstream, people were only talking about the technology. They would talk about their 386s, their 486s, their Pentium computers. Intel had the most famous ad campaign of all time, Intel Inside. Think about what Intel Inside would be in the Web3 world. It would be powered by Polygon, right? That's what Intel Inside would be. If you were to modernize Intel Inside, it would be powered by Polygon, powered by X blockchain, powered by X NFTs. All of that changed when Steve Jobs held up the iPod and said 1,000 songs in your pocket. Then all of a sudden, nobody cared about the tech and the specs. They just simply said, I want that, right? And what's interesting about that is like you're super tech savvy. We've only gotten to know each other, but you're super tech savvy from what I can tell. If I was to ask either of you, how many Intel chips are in all the devices you have today, your answer would be?
I don't know.
Right?
No idea.
And guess what? Probably I don't care. I just want it to work, right?
True, yeah.
And so like I think that for your mom, right? For my mom, this is not a mom test because like this is literally what my mom's experience has been like. Like my mom is not going to care less about the technology, meaning the NFT. She just wants to know that like she has a better experience with something. My daughter, on the other hand, my daughter is born into a world where if I grew up playing games, she's living games, right? Like, so I watch her with Pokemon Go, like walking down the street trying to capture things, right? She's living a game. So she's living a merged reality. And this is not something new. Like we've been living merged realities since, I would argue, since the Sony Walkman came out and people were all of a sudden for the first time ever able to have like a soundtrack to their lives, right? But she's living a really interesting merged reality. And so for my daughter, like the experience has to lead and has to be super organic and interesting. If you could solve for both of those groups, you know, like the individual who's never going to own cryptocurrency, is never going to own a digital wallet, is never going to care about like the technology itself, but just wants a better experience. And the person who, you know, is so digitally native, but doesn't ultimately care about the technology, but is willing to experiment with everything, like everyone in the middle sort of gets figured out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. But I guess, you know, it takes time.
Yeah.
And we're early. And like you said, Keith, soon it won't be Web3. It will just be
Indeed.
something. I don't know what, but it won't be Web3. And then we'll have to change the name of this podcast.
But that's a good, here's the good news, Rachel, right? Like I think that we're at a point where it's like the next 24 months is going to be key, right? For a lot of adoption and for a lot of sort of innovation to take place. The history of great brands that have emerged attached to trend lines have evolved, right? GQ was originally Gentleman's Quarterly, right? Like, but nobody calls it that, right? And so I'm sure if the biggest problem with the success of this podcast is ultimately that you have Web3 in the name, I'm sure given your creativity, you will figure out how to rebrand this when the day comes that you're like, you know what? Web3 has been so fully adopted that this is what the new name is going to be.
Yeah. And that day will be very exciting. I can't wait for that day.
I can't wait for it either.
Cool.
And so thank you both so much for having me today.
Yeah. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you, Keith.